One of the shapes that's surprisingly tricky to make are simple cylinders that are much taller than they are wide. The method I've used to make these has changed a lot over the last couple of years, mainly to counter some problems I was having with these leaning over to one side as they dried. Thus, in this week's video, I'm going to take you through my technique of throwing and trimming cylinders. The first thing to discuss, really, are three very simple things. The first is the ideal cylinder and what I'm aiming to make. Then I'll cover two very common issues, which I've certainly encountered in my own work in the past and have been proactively trying to fix as the years go by. On the left we have what I think is the perfect cylinder. The walls are pretty much even throughout, with perhaps a touch more thickness towards the bottom and a rim that bevels to a finer point. This is really what I'm aiming for when I make my cylinders. The vessel in the middle shows what happens when you overpull the lowest section, creating a thin patch towards the base, which, once trimmed on the outside, can cause issues such as slumping, the vessel losing its perfectly cylindrical shape as this portion of the wall can no longer support all the weight above it. Then there's the third issue, which is a heavy cylinder made as you didn't create a wide enough base initially, or you haven't pressed the clay out using something like a throwing stick later on in the process. Obviously, when you're making pots like this, you can't easily reach your hand all the way down inside. So often when I'm throwing these, I commonly use a throwing stick to smooth the interior walls or to press them out further. Either way, in this video, I'm going to go over how I throw shapes like these, and I'll be troubleshooting many more of the problems that arise. Here's roughly what I'm looking for in the final product. At this stage, these pots are really light, and they have sharp, beveled rims that visually give the pot the appearance of being very light, and perhaps most importantly, the internal walls are straight from bottom to top. In fact, I'd say the most important thing about throwing these is getting the interior shape right, as any major inconsistency will just come back to bite me when I trim them. The other really important thing about making these is drying them slowly, be that from freshly thrown to leather hard, or from leather hard to bone dry, as if any of that process is rushed, that's when issues arise. I'm not measuring the clay out for these perfectly, but for each I'll be using about 1,000 grams of clay, or a touch over. And the very first step that goes into helping you throw successful, tall cylinders is really properly wedging the clay. I mean doing it excessively so, as in a way when I'm making things such as simple mugs or bowls, if there is a seldom air pocket or a touch of firm clay here and there, I know with my throwing ability I can easily deal with it. But with these sorts of shapes where the clay is constantly going to be stretched out and then collared in, any inconsistency in the lump of clay will just make that far more difficult, especially as the cylinder becomes narrower and taller. And you'll find that if you are throwing these with clay that hasn't been prepared very well, the rims of your cylinders will be constantly wavering, and as you collar the clay in, you'll find that the walls of your pots will constantly want to twist and buckle. So, the first step is to just really thoroughly wedge the lumps of clay. And then, once these are eventually taken over onto the wheel, I probably spend an equal amount of time centering each lump, especially coning it up and down, which I do numerous times. It's a process that helps align the particles of clay, making it more responsive, plastic and easier to throw. Sometimes when you begin centering a lump of clay, you can feel like there's some kind of inconsistency within it. And essentially this process of moving the clay up and down just continues to wedge the clay in a more thorough way. It's also, I should note, a technique I've made a much more thorough video about, which I'll leave a link to on screen now and in the description below. Before I cone the clay up, I round the top of the lump. This way, as it's pressed up, it doesn't create a volcano at the top, a divot, which can otherwise trap water or slip inside. The cone of clay is then bent forward, and in one smooth motion, I press it back into a thick lump like this. And once fully centered, without any undulations or movement in it, I can find center and press in with my thumb and index finger to create the initial opening. If I feel like it gets dry as I press my fingers in, I'll take one hand off, fetch some more water or slip, and then continue. If the clay does dry out too much, you'll find your fingers will stick to it, and there's a greater chance that the spinning clay will be drawn off center. My aim at this stage is to leave the base about 1 centimeter to 1.5 centimeters thick, and I also want to keep throwing it and shaping it until that internal corner is more or less a right angle. This is sort of where you're setting the foundations for the rest of the cylinder, and if you don't open it up enough initially and leave that internal corner improperly curved, that's when you end up with a shape like this, with too much material trapped on the inside, which can be difficult to properly pull up into the final shape. If you do end up with a shape like this, when it comes to trimming it at the leather hard stage, if you do end up trimming it to be light enough, you'll end up with a shape that tapers from top to bottom, as there's much more material to remove in the lower section. So if anything, make this initial opening a bit wider than need be, and make sure where the floor meets the wall is pretty much a right angle. I've exaggerated it in this instance, as I normally wouldn't scrape it clean to such a degree at this stage. I then spend a moment just centering this outer ring of clay, and then, to make subsequent pulling easier, the first bit of pulling I do is really just some collaring. I press 2 wetted hands around the outside and press those walls in. This directs the clay upward, and as it's thinner, I can more easily press in with my knuckle at the bottom, creating that initial groove which I then lift up. On the inside, my fingertips are pressing out where that bump is, and the knuckle on the outside is lifting it up, but I'm also using the index finger of my left hand to press down and compress the rim to keep it under control and to nullify any undulation. After each pull, I'll also wet the top and compress in with both of my hands, like so. Again, this is just to stabilise everything and to minimise any slight undulations that could be in this piece. Now, for these tool cylinders, my aim is to get as much of the clay up as I can in the first couple of pulls. I'm especially trying to get it out of the bottom, even if that means it resides in the top 2/3. As long as a majority of the clay has been shifted out of the bottom portion, it means I'll still have access to it as the cylinder gets taller. Whereas if it was all trapped in the bottom and the cylinder was beyond a certain height, then it can actually be rather difficult to reach your hand all the way inside without potentially distorting or damaging the cylinder beyond repair. I should also mention that the clay I'm using is on the firm side. You really don't want to use sopping wet material for this, as it lacks strength compared to firmer stuff like this. One indicator that the bottom is generally thin enough is that the clay will begin to ripple, like so. If your clay is firm enough, it can withstand this without collapsing, but if it's too soft, it could likely twist, buckle, and collapse. In order to fix this, I firmly hold the kidney where I want the profile of the cylinder to be, and then I firmly press the clay out against it. I'm not pressing the kidney into the clay, rather the clay is being pressed out against it. Once that slight ripple at the bottom has been fixed, I can continue throwing the cylinder as normal. And as now most of the weight is in the top 2/3, I can begin to collar in the cylinder further, as there isn't really much of a need to reach down all the way to the bottom anymore. As the process of pulling up the walls often distorts them, after each pull the walls are collared in, and I normally will try and do one last sneaky pull just from the very bottom but using my fingertips. This way I can really feel the cross-section of the clay, as when you throw with the sponge you are sort of losing a bit of the sensation. I dig my fingertip into the vessel, creating a groove at the bottom and then lifting up. This final pull really thins the clay out here, but due to the positioning of my arms and hands, it's difficult to continue this all the way to the top, so at a certain point I release pressure, change my hand's position, and then continue thinning out that top portion. I can then collar in the slightly bellied out portion of the pot, converting that outward width into vertical height. This is something that's actually really tricky to do if the walls of the cylinder are wafer thin, as they will just want to buckle and ripple beneath your hands. And it's for that reason that I do, sort of, throw my cylinders slightly on the thick side. But before I talk more about that, I want to talk about converting horizontal width into vertical height, as this is something you can do throughout much of the throwing process, although it of course becomes more difficult when you're doing it atop of a thrown cylinder. But it's a technique I use when making these pots, not to the extreme that you just saw, but often when you reach your hand down inside a cylinder like this, you do end up distorting and bellying it out, which, whilst irritating, is something you have to work around. But often I end up throwing this bellied portion thinner, and then I collar the whole thing up. Once I'm happy with the height and width of the cylinder, I neaten the top by scraping away any undulation in the lip. And yes, I've left it thick at this stage, as the issue is as these pots dry, they can move and distort. Thus, if the rim is really razor sharp, it'll be more susceptible to warping as it dries, so I leave them purposefully thick to add stability to the vessel as it dries out to leather hard. The next thing I do is assess the shape of the cylinder as a whole. I use a throwing stick for this, and I find that the piece with the finer edge works best for this final bit of shaping I'm going to do. It's quite subtle, but this cylinder pinches in the lower third, and so with this throwing stick I'm going to insert it inside and belly out that pinched portion. Often when doing this I'll keep one hand on the rim of the vessel, stabilising it, whilst the other hand works the throwing stick and gently presses the wall out. Now, in some ways, I don't mind if I press the wall out too much at this point, as the next step is scraping the walls flat from the outside, which means if any portion of the pot is bulging out slightly, I can just scrape it back to being flat. It's at this stage that I remove the skirt of clay from around the bottom, and I'm really careful when doing this not to let too much clump up on the tool, as if it does it can collide with the wall of the pot, distorting it, which, as it's quite difficult to reach all the way down here, can be difficult to fix. The final thing I'm doing is twofold. I use a sponge on a stick to remove any slip or water left on the inside, and I'm also really observing the interior shape. If I see any lumps or bumps or inconsistencies, I'm going to press them outward. Even if that does end up distorting the exterior shape, I can always correct that at the leather hard stage. But the interior is very difficult to fix or change beyond this point, so I'm making sure that the interior shape is just as straight as the outside. If you were to look inside the cylinder, and you can see that the base portion is much more narrow than the opening of the vase, then of course the cylinder itself is going to feel bottom heavy, whereas the wall should look straight from bottom to top. Even if the walls are slightly on the thicker side, you'll be able to trim the outside walls back, knowing that the interior shape is nice and straight, without any strange undulations in the walls or throwing rings that are overly prominent. The next step is to slide a serrated metal wire underneath the pot, and then I clasp it with dry hands and lift it away. And because I leave some heft in the rim, they hold their shape really well. Now, when I say I'm throwing these thick, they really aren't quite as thick as you might imagine. Perhaps what I really mean is that I'm not trying to squeeze every single inch out of the lump of clay. You could throw this same weight of clay into a taller vessel that's wafer thin and with a rim to match, that doesn't require any trimming. But in the past, for me at least, I found that when I do that I run into more issues. The most prominent one being that the pots need to be dried out insanely carefully. This means not only removing them from the wheel in such a way that they don't move whatsoever, as a very thin, very tall cylinder could tip to one side just ever so slightly, but from that point on, if you do plan on trimming them, you also need to dry them slowly and carefully. Otherwise they can lean to one side if they dry out more quickly on one side than the other, which I can demonstrate rather easily here. As you can see, the cylinder in this state is completely centered and is spinning very evenly. But if I dry it out from one side only, you can see how the vase leans in one direction and how then, once spun, it's now completely off center, undulating, and in this state it will be horrible to trim. The thinner your cylinders are, the worse they'll do this if you dry them in an inappropriate manner. So instead I throw them like this, with walls that are perhaps a touch on the thick side, but the most important thing is that they're even from top to bottom. And during the throwing stage I'll straighten the wall from the inside using one of these throwing sticks. Okay, there is a touch more thickness in the central portion of the wall, but again, as long as this interior shape is straight, I can trim the form back from the outside at the leather hard stage to my desired thickness. And the added heft will just help the vessel hold its shape as it turns leather hard. The one thing I'd never do is throw a batch of cylinders and then leave them out overnight to dry, as inevitably a draft will hit them from one side and they'll end up leaning in that direction, making trimming an utter nightmare. So instead, when I throw a batch of these, I begin by filling up a board, and then for the rest of the day whilst they're still out, I'll actively turn them around by about 90 degrees every hour or so. I'll also keep them out of direct sunlight, and then towards the end of the day and overnight, I'll wrap them up with plastic sheeting so they dry out much more carefully and without a draft hitting them from one side in particular. This is how I have chosen to make them, and it's how I end up with the straightest, lightest, most crisp cylinders. Yes, they are quite intensively trimmed, but I prefer this careful, perhaps slightly slower approach, although the actual throwing of these cylinders is relatively straightforward, as I'm not fussing about making them exceptionally thin at this stage. Yet at the same time, making these is a good exercise in throwing pots in a balanced, even way, with walls that are consistent from top to bottom. In a way, I think this is something that's often overlooked, as pots don't actually have to feel incredibly light. In fact, they can be a touch on the heavier side, as long as the weight is distributed properly throughout them. I have lots of pots by Sven Bayer, Annemeta Herzog, Lisa Hammond and Phil Rogers that all meet the same criteria. The pots aren't light, but they're balanced. They're made consistently, and that's often enough. Now, overnight I'm just going to drape some plastic loosely over these. I want them to dry out a bit, but I certainly don't want to rush the process. The following morning they are a touch on the soft side, but I'm simply going to leave them out for a few more hours. I'll keep rotating them, and I'll make sure to flip them upside down and the right way up, so that the lowest portion of the pot is just as firm as the top. Once they are completely leather hard and even, I can begin the trimming process. And even though I dried these out really carefully, you can see there is still some movement in the vessel, so I flip it upside down and quickly just trim the base level. This also creates a surface that's smooth and flush, and once slipped it'll stick to the metal wheelhead much better. Once set down, I tap center the vase, and the friction in combination with the slip quickly dries it out and fuses the pot to the metal very securely. I can then begin to trim away the thicker walls, yet you don't have to trim away as much as I do. Considering the pot itself already feels balanced, you could just merely straighten the walls and bevel the lip to a sharper point, but I'm pushing it beyond that. I want to end up with a cylinder that's much lighter and almost defies your expectations, especially as the glazes I normally use have to go on very thickly, thus adding weight back to the object. If I started with the original weight I had, and then trimmed it very lightly, and then glaze it in the way I intend to, I'd probably end up with an object that is actually on the heavy side, which for me, in my own body of work, is something I want to avoid. With the walls feeling lovely and thin, I can then begin work on the lip, which I'm going to bevel so that it comes to a sharper edge, coming to its apex on the outermost portion of the wall. Visually, this will give the impression that the cylinder really is much lighter and thinner than it actually is, despite the object at this point actually being really thin. By taking the lip to this refined point, it enters a realm of finesse where pots aren't typically taken. You'll find metal and glass finished to this degree, but pots tend to be left thicker on the whole. The only downside for this particular shape is because it's such a narrow, light shape, it can very easily be toppled over. So in the past, with some of these I've used at home, I partly fill them up with sand just to add some stability. For the rim itself, I compress it first with a damp sponge, and then I go over this with a very smooth plastic kidney, taking it to a point that's glassy, as the glaze will settle onto it in a much smoother layer once fired. Next, I use a metal kidney just to tidy up the outside shape, scraping over the worst of the turning marks and flattening the slight chattering you may have seen in places. It's also at this stage that I can use the tool like a guide to ensure that the surface is straight. I'm looking for a very straight, crisp finish, so I spend rather a lot of time making sure it's right, although the hardest part is arguably yet to come, and that's trimming the underside of the vase. I begin by separating it from the wheel by sliding a metal skim beneath it. It's then placed in the middle, and then once tap-centered, which I do gently, I position 3 rather large lugs of clay around it. These need to be substantial, otherwise the cylinder will just topple over to one side. That's sort of what you'll be fighting against the entire time. When you're trimming so high up and working the tool outward from the centre, you're constantly coaxing the vase over. So in order to negate this further, I use a spinner, which I place on top and tap centre, and through this I can apply downward pressure to help keep the cylindrical vase pinned down in place as I trim. This is another topic, by the way, I've made a much longer video about, a link to which I'll leave on screen now and in the description below. I press really firmly through this, especially when I trim the bevel around the outside, yet I will of course have to remove it when it comes to actually trimming the underside. But once removed, I'm still going to be applying downward pressure, but instead of it being applied through this spinner, I'm instead doing it with the fingers of my left hand and the turning tool itself. I'm going to hollow out a small portion in the foot of this. There isn't a ton of material to work with, but at the same time I always find there's a bit more than I imagine. So by removing a fraction of clay from the underside, not only does it create a slightly more decorative foot, but it also removes the last bit of weight from the bottoms of these. I find that tungsten carbide tools work wonderfully for feet like this, because as they're so sharp, you don't actually have to apply much downward pressure in order for the tool to bite and remove clay. Whereas if you were using a steel tool, which are generally far more dull, you may need to apply a considerable amount of force. And if the base isn't thick enough to handle that, well, that's when you trim holes through the bottoms of your pots. I periodically check how thick the bottom is by lightly pressing on it with a thumb. If I can see or feel like the floor gives slightly, then I know it's time to stop trimming. I then stamp it with my maker's mark, which, yes, I accidentally did the wrong way round here, but at least if you ever purchase one of my vases, you'll be able to identify that it is in fact this very one. I then place the cylindrical vase on an HPL bat, which is immensely smooth and won't leave any indentations in the base of the pot. As the pot has just been trimmed on its rim, I double check this part to make sure it's pristine, as it's very common when a pot is placed upside down for it to scratch or to be imprinted with tiny burrs of clay. So again, I just use a dense wet sponge to get rid of the worst of these, if there are any. I also, for no particular reason, run it up and down the surface to get rid of any of the grubby fingerprints that might be covering it. And that's one of these highly refined cylindrical vases finished, and it really is light considering its size. I think it's important to understand that if you're new to throwing, or if you're still developing your style, is that there truly is no one best way of making pottery. Yet when you're first learning, you need to follow the instructions of your tutor, as it does help to have some sort of rule set at the start, so that you have some rough guides to follow. But then, as your skill increases, I'd say the best thing you can possibly do to broaden your skill set is to test out and experiment with as many different styles of making as possible, as it's so rare to find two potters who make the same pot in precisely the same way. For instance, I could give another potter this same clay, the same tools and the same wheel, and still the pots produced would be wildly different, and that really is a good thing. It's a fascinating thing too, especially when you consider how pottery seemingly sprung up all over the world in different times, and we all made pots with different tools, different clay types, and different kilns. So there is no one way of making pottery, and I do often receive rather a lot of backlash, mainly from more seasoned potters, for the amount of turning I do. I think in many cases these people don't necessarily understand how thin the pots are I'm making, but it also comes from a position where efficiency and speed are considered the most important factors to producing work. As an apprentice, I really enjoyed this facet of practicing, of learning to make rapidly and efficiently, as it added a tremendous amount of ability to my skill set. Yet, nowadays, I try to balance that out with quality and originality, and I'm also lucky enough as a potter to be able to sell each individual piece for a considerable amount, as in many cases the pots are borderline pieces of art. That obviously isn't the case for everybody, and there are potters who continue selling mugs for $15 to $30 for decades. And when you're producing work like that, speed and efficiency is arguably more important. Thus, my advice to you, if you are a beginner, is to test out how to throw these cylinders in numerous ways, but then also go through the entire process of drying them and trimming them, as you'll certainly encounter your own problems. And then you get to encounter the most interesting part of the entire process, the problem solving. It's no fun having somebody spoon feed everything to you, and I think there comes a point in your practice where learning how to tackle problems in your own way with your own pots almost becomes the most exciting part of the process. The opening of this piece was a tiny bit warped from where I pressed the supportive lugs of clay around it, so I just inserted a cup with a tapering base and twisted it in place a few times, which did a surprisingly good job of fixing it. Just be careful you don't press it in too much, as by doing so you could cause the upper portion and the lip to splay outward, and thus completely destroying the straight cylindrical shape you were going for. So let's see how much one of these weighs after being trimmed. 462 grams, so it's about half of the initial thrown weight, considering much of the moisture has also evaporated, as the vase turned leather hard. The last thing I do is cover these with a sheet of plastic, and I'll wrap them tightly so that no drafts can get to them. Anyway, that's how I make my cylindrical vases. There's quite a bit of work in them, but I don't mind the extra time it takes, provided it leaves me with a cylinder that's straighter, lighter, and more refined than I might be able to produce otherwise. I hope you found this weekend's video helpful. Thanks, as always, for taking your time to watch. And, as always, I'll see you next time.